Sometimes the most profound messages come from the ones who love us most, even when they can't speak our language. For 72-year-old Tahu, that messenger was his beloved mare, who kept bringing him stones from the canyon. For 3 weeks she returned with the same gift: grey stones, smooth as glass, placed carefully at his feet. Most people would call it strange behavior, but Tahu knew better. His grandfather taught him that horses see things we miss. They remember what the land wants us to know. This morning felt different. As he watched her trot toward the canyon again, Tahu realized she wasn't collecting stones. She was trying to show him something important, something buried in that canyon that only she could find. What had she discovered that was worth carrying to him, stone by stone, day after day? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The high desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of rust-colored earth dotted with sage and ancient juniper trees that had witnessed centuries pass like seasons. Here, in this remote corner of Arizona where the Mogollon Rim met the sky, time moved differently. It pooled in the shadows of stone formations and eddied around the memories that lingered in every wind-carved canyon. Tahu Begay stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, his calloused hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had belonged to his grandmother. The coffee had grown cold an hour ago, but he held it still, finding comfort in its familiar weight. At 72, his body bore the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent reading the subtle language of the desert, the way morning light fell differently before a storm, how the horses gathered near the barn when distant thunder still hid beyond the horizon. His mare, Ayana, grazed in the pasture beyond the weathered fence posts, her coat the color of burnished copper in the early light. She was a Mustang he'd rescued 7 years ago, wild-born with eyes that held the untamed spirit of her ancestors. Most men would have broken her to the saddle and bridle, but Tahu understood that some things were meant to remain free, even in captivity. Their partnership was built on respect, not dominance, a lesson he'd learned from watching his grandfather work with horses in the days when the old ways still mattered. The distant sound of a pickup truck grinding up the dirt road drew his attention. A plume of dust followed the vehicle like a brown prayer flag against the blue morning sky. Tahu recognized the engine's labored wheeze, his nephew Marcus driving the same battered Ford he'd inherited from their grandfather 3 decades ago. Some things endured not because they were perfect, but because they carried the weight of history in their bones. Marcus stepped out of the truck, his boots stirring small clouds of dust as he approached the porch. At 45, he straddled 2 worlds, the reservation where tradition still whispered in the old tongue, and the modern city where he worked as a contractor, building homes for families who would never understand the sacred relationship between land and spirit. His visits had become more frequent lately, carrying with them the subtle urgency of unspoken concerns. "Uncle," Marcus said, touching his hat brim in the old gesture of respect. "You're up early even for you." Tahu smiled, noting how his nephew's eyes automatically scanned the horizon, reading the weather patterns with the same instinctive knowledge that ran in their blood. The land speaks loudest in the morning, before the world gets noisy with its own importance. They settled into the comfortable rhythm of family conversation, the kind that meandered like a desert stream, touching on immediate concerns and deeper currents with equal ease. Marcus spoke of his work, the challenges of raising children who felt pulled between 2 cultures, the way the old stories sometimes seemed inadequate in the face of modern pressures. Tahu listened with the patience of a man who understood that wisdom often came disguised as worry. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice taking on a careful quality that made Tahu look up from his cold coffee. "I've been hearing talk in town about this area. Survey crews, maybe developers looking to buy up land for some kind of resort project." The words settled between them like stones dropped in still water, sending ripples outward through the morning quiet. Tahu had heard similar talk before, The endless hunger of progress for untouched spaces, the way money transformed sacred ground into commodity. He'd watched it happen to other families, seen the slow erosion of connection as ancestral lands disappeared beneath concrete and asphalt. "Let them talk," Tahu said finally. "This land has been in our family for 4 generations. My grandfather bought it from the bank when they were practically giving desert away to anyone fool enough to want it. Paper says it's ours," Marcus nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Paper can be changed, Uncle, especially when there's enough money involved." Before Tahu could respond, movement in the pasture caught his eye. Ayana had lifted her head from the grass, her ears pricked forward with an alertness that spoke of something beyond ordinary awareness. She stood motionless for several heartbeats, as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. Then, with the fluid grace of wild things, she turned and trotted toward the gate that led to the canyon trail. "There she goes again," Tahu murmured, watching his mare disappear between the towering sandstone formations that marked the entrance to the narrow canyon. "Third time this week," Marcus followed his uncle's gaze. "Where does she go?" "Same place each time. Up the old mining trail, past the place where the Apache used to make summer camp. She comes back in a few hours, usually carrying something in her mouth." "Carrying what?" Tahu gestured toward a small collection of stones arranged on the porch railing. 8 smooth grey rocks, each about the size of a child's fist. In the morning light, they seemed to glow with an inner fire, their surfaces polished by centuries of water and wind. These, always the same kind, always from the same direction. Marcus picked up one of the stones, turning it over in his palm. The surface was surprisingly warm and seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. "They're beautiful, but why would she bring them to you?" "I've been wondering the same thing." Tahu set down his mug and joined his nephew at the railing. "Horses don't usually collect things without reason. My grandfather used to say that animals sometimes see things we've forgotten how to notice, patterns in the earth, memories that got buried but never really died." The 2 men stood in comfortable silence, contemplating the mystery of the stones and the deeper questions they represented. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled high above the canyon, its cries echoing off the stone walls like the voices of ancestors calling across time. The desert stretched away in all directions, holding its secrets close, revealing them only to those who knew how to listen. Marcus turned the stone over again, feeling its weight and warmth. "Maybe she's trying to tell you something." "Maybe," Tahu agreed, though his voice carried the weight of deeper contemplation. "Or maybe she's showing me something I need to see." The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the desert seem like a vast cathedral, its red stone pillars reaching toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Tahu had spent the night dreaming of his grandfather's voice, speaking in the old Apache tongue about horses that carried messages between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. He woke before dawn with a certainty that settled in his chest like warm honey. Today, he would follow Ayana's trail to its source. He prepared carefully, with the methodical attention to detail that came from decades of desert survival. Water bottles, a small pack with jerky and hardtack, his grandfather's field glasses, and the Winchester rifle that had belonged to 3 generations of his family. The rifle had seen action in 2 world wars and countless hunts, its wooden stock worn smooth by familiar hands. Most importantly, he saddled Nalnish, his steady gelding who had the good sense to trust his rider's judgment, even when that judgment led into unknown territory. Marcus arrived just as Tahu was checking his saddle cinch for the 3rd time. "You don't have to do this alone, Uncle." "Yes, I do." Tahu's voice carried gentle finality. "This is something between the land and me. You have responsibilities in town, a family that needs you. Some paths can only be walked by one person." They shared coffee and watched the sun paint the canyon walls with shifting patterns of gold and rose. Ayana stood near the fence, alert and ready, as if she understood that today would be different. When Tahu finally mounted Nalnish and opened the gate, she immediately set off toward the canyon with the purposeful, stride of a guide leading a long-awaited expedition. The trail into the canyon was familiar for the first mile, a well-worn path that Tahu had ridden countless times over the years. But where he usually turned back, Ayana continued deeper into the maze of stone corridors and hidden passages that honeycomb the desert landscape. The walls grew higher on either side, their surfaces decorated with the patient artwork of wind and water, creating galleries of natural sculpture that few human eyes had ever witnessed. Nalnish picked his way carefully over loose stones and around weathered boulders, his ears swiveling constantly as he processed the subtle sounds that echoed off the canyon walls. The deeper they traveled, the more the world seemed to narrow and focus, as if they were moving through a telescope that brought distant objects into sharp relief. After 2 hours of steady climbing, Ayana stopped at what appeared to be a dead end, a wall of red sandstone that rose vertically for hundreds of feet. But as Tahu dismounted and approached on foot, he noticed that the wall had a subtle irregularity, a shadow that suggested depth rather than solid stone. Hidden behind a curtain of brush and fallen rocks, invisible unless approached from exactly the right angle, was a narrow opening barely wide enough for a horse to pass. Ayana stepped through the opening without hesitation. Disappearing into what Tahu could now see was a natural corridor that curved away into darkness. He followed on foot, leading Nalnish through the gap and finding himself in a hidden chamber that opened like a secret room inside the canyon's heart. The space was larger than his ranch house, carved by centuries of water flow into a perfect natural cathedral. Shafts of sunlight filtered down through openings high above, creating pillars of golden light that illuminated the chamber's sandy floor. But it was what lay scattered throughout this hidden sanctuary that took Tahu's breath away. Along the walls, tucked into natural alcoves and protected by overhanging stone, were bundles wrapped in oiled cloth. Some were large enough to contain a person, others small as a child's toy box. The careful placement and preservation spoke of deliberate concealment, not casual abandonment. This was a vault, a sacred repository hidden from the world above. Ayana stood in the center of the chamber, calm and patient, as if she had brought him to a place she had always known. Her dark eyes reflected the filtered sunlight, and in that moment, Tahu understood that this discovery was no accident. His mare had been leading him here from the beginning, stone by stone, day by day, until he was ready to see what his ancestors had hidden in this secret place. With trembling hands, he approached the nearest bundle. The cloth was ancient but well preserved, sealed with a resin that had protected its contents from moisture and time. As he carefully unwrapped the package, the first thing that caught the light was a flash of silver, Spanish colonial jewelry, coins bearing the marks of New World mints, crucifixes crafted by European artisans centuries ago. But mixed with the Spanish treasures were artifacts that spoke to his soul in a different language. Apache medicine bundles, their sacred contents still potent after generations of careful preservation. Turquoise stones arranged in patterns that told stories older than written history. Pottery fragments that bore the fingerprints of his ancestors. Pressed into clay, when this land knew no borders save those drawn by river and mountain. As Tahu held these artifacts, understanding began to dawn like sunrise over the desert. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a museum of survival, a collection of everything his people had managed to save when the world tried to erase them. During the Apache Wars, when soldiers burned villages and scattered families, someone had taken the time to preserve the most precious remnants of their culture. They had hidden them here, in this secret chamber, trusting that someday the right person would find them. The grey stones Ayana had been bringing him weren't random gifts. They were markers, breadcrumbs, leading to this moment of discovery. She had somehow known what lay hidden in the canyon's heart, and she had spent weeks preparing him for this revelation. Tahu sank to his knees on the sandy floor, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had found. These weren't just artifacts. They were the preserved souls of his people, the tangible proof that no matter how hard the world tried to forget them, they had endured. His ancestors had died protecting these treasures, and now, by some miracle guided by an extraordinary horse, the responsibility had passed to him. The sun had moved across the sky during his exploration, and the quality of light in the chamber was changing. He knew he should return home, should think carefully about what this discovery meant and what obligations it placed upon him. But as he carefully rewrapped the artifacts and prepared to leave, one thing was absolutely certain. His life had just changed forever. Ayana led him back through the hidden passage with the same sure-footed confidence she had shown on the journey in. As they emerged into the main canyon, Tahu looked back at the concealed entrance, already wondering if he would be able to find it again without his mare's guidance. But deep in his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. The grey stones had shown him the way to one secret chamber, but the systematic nature of the concealment suggested there might be others. That evening, Tahu sat on his porch as the desert surrendered to twilight, the Spanish silver cross resting in his weathered palm. He had brought only one artifact back with him, a small crucifix that seemed to bridge two worlds with its delicate craftsmanship. Spanish silverwork intertwined with Apache turquoise inlay, creating something that belonged fully to neither culture, yet somehow honored both. The cross felt warm against his skin, as if it retained the heat of all the hands that had held it before. According to the stories passed down through generations, such pieces had been created during the brief periods of peace between the Apache and Spanish settlers, when trade and even friendship had flourished in the shadow of larger conflicts. This particular cross might have hung around the neck of a Spanish missionary who had earned Apache trust, or perhaps an Apache woman who had found love across cultural boundaries. Marcus arrived as full darkness settled over the land, bringing with him the practical concerns of the outside world. He found his uncle still sitting in silence, turning the cross over and over in his hands like a worry stone. "You found something," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside Tahu. It wasn't a question. The change in his uncle's demeanor was as obvious as sunrise. Tahu nodded slowly, then handed the cross to his nephew. Marcus examined it in the pale light from the porch lamp, his breath catching as he recognized the significance of what he held. "Uncle, this is museum quality. Where did you find this?" "In the place Ayana showed me, hidden in the canyon, in a chamber that's been sealed for more than a century." Tahu's voice carried the weight of revelation. "It's not just one piece, Marcus. There are bundles, dozens of them, containing things I thought were lost forever." Marcus leaned forward, the cross forgotten in his hands. "What kind of things?" "Spanish colonial artifacts mixed with Apache sacred objects. Jewelry, coins, weapons, medicine bundles. In pottery, like someone gathered up all the most precious items they could carry and hid them in the safest place they could find." Tahu gestured toward the canyon entrance, invisible now in the darkness. "Your great-great-grandfather's stories were true. During the wars, when the soldiers came, some of our people managed to save what mattered most. The implications settled between them like evening fog. This wasn't just a family discovery. It was a piece of American history that had been hidden in plain sight for generations. The monetary value alone would be staggering, but the cultural significance transcended any price tag." "We have to tell someone," Marcus said finally. "The tribal council, the university, someone who can properly document this." "Do we?" Tahu asked, taking the cross back. "Once we tell the outside world, we lose control of what happens next. Government archaeologists, museum curators, lawyers arguing over ownership. Is that what our ancestors wanted when they hid these things?" Marcus had no immediate answer. He understood his uncle's reluctance, the deep-seated wariness that came from centuries of watching outsiders take what belonged to the Apache people. But he also recognized that the discovery was too significant to keep secret. "What does Ayana think?" he asked, only half joking. As if summoned by her name, the mare appeared at the pasture fence, her copper coat gleaming in the moonlight. She stood perfectly still, watching the two men on the porch with an intelligence that seemed almost human. In her mouth was another grey stone, identical to all the others. Tahu rose and walked to the fence, accepting the stone from his mare's gentle mouth. She brought 8 stones before I followed her. Now she's brought a 9th. I don't think she's finished showing me things. Examining the new stone by lamplight, Tahu noticed something he had missed in the others. Tiny scratches on the surface, so faint they were barely visible, but when he held the stone at the right angle, the marks became clear. Symbols, carved with a delicate tool, forming a pattern that meant nothing to the casual observer, but spoke volumes to someone who had grown up hearing the old stories. Direction markers, he whispered, tracing the almost invisible symbols with his fingertip. This isn't just a stone, it's a map fragment. These marks point to something specific. Marcus joined him at the fence, squinting to make out the tiny carvings. If each stone has different markings, then there are multiple locations, Tahu finished. A whole network of hiding places, marked by stones that only someone who knew the old symbols could read. The magnitude of the discovery was beginning to dawn on them both. This wasn't just a single cache of artifacts. It was evidence of a systematic preservation effort, planned and executed by Apache leaders who had foreseen the destruction coming to their people. They had created a treasure map scattered across the landscape. Hidden in plain sight for anyone wise enough to read the signs, Ayana whickered softly, then turned and walked back toward the center of the pasture, her task for the evening complete. She had brought them the key to understanding the larger puzzle, just as she had brought them the first clues weeks ago. "We need to examine all the stones," Marcus said, his voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "If they're all marked with directions, then we have a responsibility," Tahu agreed. "Not just to find what was hidden, but to decide what to do with it once we have it." They gathered the stones from the porch railing, carrying them inside where Tahu's reading lamp provided better illumination. One by one, they examined each stone, finding symbols carved with such precision that they were nearly invisible until viewed from exactly the right angle. The markings were different on each stone, but followed a consistent pattern. Directional indicators combined with distance markers, all rendered in a code that had been passed down through generations of Apache storytellers. "Your grandfather taught you these symbols," Marcus said, watching his uncle decode the markings with growing confidence. "Some of them. Enough to understand the basic meaning." Tahu arranged the stones in a rough circle on his kitchen table. "But I think we need to visit the tribal elders. Speak with the ones who still remember the old knowledge. This is bigger than just our family now." As midnight approached, they sat surrounded by the stones and their implications. The Spanish cross rested in the center of their impromptu war council, its turquoise inlay catching the lamplight like captured stars. Outside, Ayana grazed peacefully in the moonlight, her work for the day completed, but her larger mission just beginning. "Uncle," Marcus said quietly, "what if we're not the only ones who know about this? What if those survey crews, those developers, what if they're not here for resort land?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying with it all the darker possibilities that neither man wanted to voice. If word of the discovery had somehow leaked, if treasure hunters or artifact thieves were already closing in, then time was running out faster than they had imagined. Tahu gathered up the stones, feeling their weight, not just physical, but spiritual and historical. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of following where these markers led, but tonight he would guard them as his ancestors had guarded the treasures they pointed to. The responsibility felt as heavy as mountain stone, but also as necessary as breathing. Dawn found Tahu back in the hidden chamber, this time accompanied by Marcus and armed with proper lighting and photography equipment. The second visit revealed details that had been lost in the emotional overwhelm of discovery. As they carefully documented each bundle before opening it, a clearer picture began to emerge of what had been preserved and why. The Apache medicine bundle rested in his hands like a living thing, its leather wrapping soft with age but intact. Unlike the Spanish artifacts, which spoke of trade and cultural exchange, This bundle whispered of the sacred, the deeply personal relationship between his people and the spiritual forces that governed their world. When he finally opened it, the contents took his breath away. Inside were items that belonged to a medicine man of great power, eagle feathers arranged in precise patterns, stones from sacred places, herbs that still carried their potent fragrances after more than a century. But most significantly, there was a piece of turquoise carved with symbols that Tahu recognized from his grandfather's most private stories. This wasn't just any medicine bundle, it had belonged to a specific person, a holy man whose name was still spoken with reverence among the elders. This belonged to Whitehawk, Tahu whispered, cradling the carved turquoise. He was my great-grandfather's uncle, the one who could call rain from clear skies and speak with the spirits of the canyon. Marcus lowered his camera, understanding that he was in the presence of something beyond mere historical artifact. How can you be sure? The markings, the way the stones are arranged. My grandfather described Whitehawk's medicine bundle to me when I was young. He said it was lost when the soldiers came, but hoped someday it would return to the family. Tahu's voice carried wonder and grief in equal measure. Whitehawk died fighting to protect the people's escape route during the last raids. Legend said he had hidden his power somewhere safe, where it could wait for the right time to return. As they explored deeper into the chamber, more bundles revealed their secrets. Spanish trade goods mixed with Apache craftwork told the story of a culture that had been more adaptable and complex than history books acknowledged. These weren't the artifacts of a people. Cowering in fear, they were the treasures of a civilization that had recognized the changing world and tried to preserve what was most valuable for future generations. But it was the discovery of fresh disturbances that changed everything. Near the back of the chamber, Marcus spotted something that made his blood run cold. Bootprints in the sand, too recent to be anything but contemporary. Someone else had been in this sacred place, and not long ago. Uncle, look at this. Marcus crouched beside the prince, his voice tight with concern. These are maybe a few days old, no more than a week. Tahu examined the tracks, his desert-trained eyes reading the story they told. Two different sets of boots, moving systematically through the chamber, photographing and cataloguing, but apparently not disturbing the major bundles. Professional work done by people who knew the value of what they were documenting. They knew where to look, Tahu said grimly. This wasn't a random discovery. They came here with purpose. The implications hit them both simultaneously. If others knew about the hidden chamber, then the careful secrecy that had protected these treasures for over a century had been compromised. Worse, the systematic nature of the intrusion suggested organized treasure hunters rather than casual explorers. As they hurried to document what remained, Ayana appeared at the chamber entrance, agitated in a way Tahu had never seen before. The mare paced back and forth at the opening, whinnying softly but persistently, her entire body language speaking of urgency and warning. She senses something we don't, Marcus said. Watching the horse's increasingly frantic behavior, Tahu quickly gathered the most portable and valuable artifacts, including Whitehawk's medicine bundle, wrapping them securely for transport. We need to leave now, and we need to check the other locations before whoever was here comes back. The ride home was tense, both men constantly scanning the horizon for signs of surveillance. Ayana led them by a different route, avoiding the main trails and sticking to paths that offered maximum cover from observation. Her behavior had shifted from guide to guardian, her instincts clearly detecting threats that human senses couldn't perceive. Back at the ranch, they spread the recovered artifacts across Tahu's kitchen table, creating an inventory that read like a catalogue of Apache resistance and survival. Each item told a story of a people who had refused to be erased, who had found ways to preserve their culture even in the face of systematic destruction. We need help, Marcus said, photographing each artifact with methodical precision. This is beyond what two people can handle, especially if we're dealing with professional artifact thieves. Tahu nodded. though every instinct in his body rebelled against involving outsiders in something so personal and sacred. The tribal council first, then maybe the federal authorities, but only ones who understand what this means to our people. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the dirt road. Not Marcus's familiar pickup, but something heavier, more official. Through the window, they could see a black SUV followed by a white van, both moving with the purposeful pace of a planned operation. "Did you tell anyone we were going out there today?" Tahu asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle rack. "No one," Marcus replied, already gathering the most precious artifacts. "But someone might have been watching us." The vehicles stopped just outside the property line, close enough to make their presence known, but far enough to avoid trespassing. Men in suits emerged from the SUV, while the van disgorged a team equipped with surveying equipment and cameras. The message was clear. They were being served notice that forces beyond their control were now involved. Ayana galloped to the fence nearest the vehicles, her copper coat gleaming in the afternoon sun as she paced along the barrier. Her behavior was a clear warning, the same protective instinct that had guided her ancestors when wild horses defended their territory from intruders. "Federal agents," Marcus observed, noting the government plates and official bearing of the visitors. "But which agency and what do they want?" Before Tahu could answer, one of the suited men began walking toward the house, moving with the careful confidence of someone accustomed to entering situations where he wasn't entirely welcome. In his hand was a folder that undoubtedly contained documents, authorizations, and complications that would change everything about their quiet discovery. The artifacts lay spread across the kitchen table behind them. White Hawk's medicine bundle, Spanish colonial jewelry, carved stones that held the secrets of hidden treasures. In a matter of hours, what had begun as a private family mystery had become something much larger and more dangerous. Tahu took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his ancestors' trust settling on his shoulders like a ceremonial robe. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same courage that had led his people to hide these treasures in the first place. The responsibility that had passed to him through Ayana's patient guidance wasn't just about preserving artifacts, it was about protecting the soul of his people from those who would reduce their culture to dollar signs and museum displays. The federal agent reached the porch steps, and with his arrival, the stakes of their discovery suddenly became clear. This was no longer just about family heritage or cultural preservation. It was about survival in a world where the most sacred things could become commodities overnight. Agent Sarah Coleman introduced herself with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed the authority behind her badge. "FBI," she explained, "Cultural Property Crime Team, investigating reports of systematic artifact theft from Native American sites across the Southwest." The folder she carried contained photographs of items that had appeared on the black market, items that bore striking similarities to what Tahu and Marcus had discovered. "We understand you've had some unusual activity on your property recently," Coleman said. Settling into the chair Marcus offered her on the porch. Her partner remained by the vehicles, maintaining what she called a security perimeter, but what felt more like containment. Tahu studied her face, reading the subtle signs that came from a lifetime of evaluating people's intentions. She was younger than Marcus, probably in her mid-30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of chasing criminals who thought they were smarter than law enforcement. More importantly, her approach suggested respect rather than interrogation, at least for now. "Depends on what you call unusual," Tahu replied carefully. "My horse brings me stones from the canyon. Been doing it for weeks. Some might call that unusual, but I've learned to pay attention when the land tries to tell me something." Coleman smiled at that, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "My grandmother was Navajo. She used to say the same thing about listening to what the earth wanted to share." She opened her folder, revealing photographs of artifacts that made Marcus inhale sharply. "Have you seen anything like these during your time in the canyon?" The photographs showed Spanish colonial jewelry, Apache pottery, carved stones and medicine bundles, items nearly identical to what they had discovered in the hidden chamber. But these photos had been taken in sterile environments, on laboratory tables with measurement scales, stripped of all context and meaning. "Where did you get these?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Seized from a private collector in Santa Fe who couldn't provide legitimate provenance. The collector claimed they came from estate sales, but our experts believe they were recently excavated from protected sites." Coleman studied their reactions carefully. "We think there's an organized ring stealing artifacts from tribal lands, using sophisticated equipment to locate and document sites before conducting systematic thefts." Tahu felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The boot prints in the chamber, the systematic documentation, the professional approach, it all made sense now. Treasure hunters weren't randomly searching the canyon. They had specific intelligence about what was hidden there. "Agent Coleman," he said slowly, "I think you need to see something. The decision to trust federal law enforcement went against every instinct, inherited from generations of ancestors who had learned to view government intervention with suspicion." But as Coleman examined the hand-drawn map they had found in White Hawk's medicine bundle, Tahu realized they were facing an enemy that required allies. Regardless of historical grievances, the map was drawn on treated leather, its surface covered with symbols that marked locations throughout the canyon system. At least a dozen sites were indicated, connected by trails that wound through the most remote and inaccessible parts of the desert. Each location was marked with the same type of symbols they had found carved on the gray stones, directional indicators that would mean nothing to casual observers, but provided precise navigation for anyone who understood the code. "This is incredible," Coleman breathed, photographing the map with equipment that captured details invisible to the naked eye. "Your ancestors created a comprehensive preservation system, complete with navigational aids and security measures. It's like they built a museum scattered across the landscape." Marcus pointed to several locations on the map that seemed to be marked with special significance. "These symbols here, they're different from the others. Larger, more complex. What do you think they indicate?" Before Coleman could answer, Ayana appeared at the fence, carrying another gray stone. But her behavior was different this time. Instead of approaching calmly as she usually did, she dropped the stone and retreated, pacing nervously along the fence line. Her agitation was obvious, and Tahu immediately understood the message. "She's warning us," he said, rising from his chair. "Someone's coming!" Coleman's partner spoke into his radio, confirming what Ayana had sensed minutes before human technology detected it. 2 vehicles approaching from the east, moving fast but trying to stay out of sight. Not official vehicles this time, but civilian trucks with the kind of modifications that suggested serious off-road capability. "Mr. Begay, we need to secure those artifacts immediately," Coleman said, her professional demeanor shifting into tactical mode. "If these are the people we've been tracking, they're not going to be deterred by federal presence." The next 30 minutes moved with the urgent efficiency of a military operation. Coleman's team, larger than initially apparent, emerged from concealment around the property with equipment that transformed Tahu's modest ranch into a secure facility. The artifacts were photographed, catalogued, and packed into protective containers with a speed that spoke of extensive experience in similar situations. But it was the discovery of surveillance equipment that confirmed their worst fears. Hidden cameras positioned around the property, recording devices planted near the canyon entrance, GPS trackers that had been monitoring their movements for weeks. The treasure hunters hadn't just found the hidden chamber, they had been studying Tahu and Marcus, learning their patterns, waiting for the right moment to move. "They know everything we know," Marcus said grimly, examining a camera that had been concealed in a dead tree overlooking the pasture. "They've been watching us discover the sites, then moving in after we leave." Coleman nodded, her expression hardening. "That's their standard operating procedure. Let locals do the dangerous exploration work, then sweep in with professional equipment to harvest what was found." They've used this approach on half a dozen reservations across the region. The sound of helicopters approaching from the south added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. But these weren't federal aircraft. The sound was wrong, the flight pattern too aggressive for official operations. As the aircraft came into view, their purpose became clear. Private security, the kind hired by people who had enough money to buy military-grade equipment and enough determination to use it. "This is escalating faster than we anticipated," Coleman said, speaking rapidly into her radio while gesturing for Tahu and Marcus to take cover. "We're dealing with more than artifact thieves. This is a full-scale operation." Ayana galloped across the pasture, her flight response triggered by the helicopter noise and the presence of armed strangers on her territory. But even in her panic, she stayed within sight of the house, unwilling to abandon the humans she had been protecting through her patient guidance. As federal agents took defensive positions around the property and the sound of helicopters grew closer, Tahu found himself holding Whitehawk's medicine bundle, feeling the weight of history and responsibility converge in this moment. His ancestors had hidden these treasures to preserve them for future generations, but they could never have imagined that the battle to protect them would involve helicopters and federal agents. "Whatever happens next," he told Marcus quietly, "we don't let them take what belongs to our people. Whitehawk died protecting these things once. We can do no less." The helicopters passed overhead without landing, but their message was clear. The treasure hunters weren't going to be intimidated by federal presence. They had invested too much time and resources in this operation to walk away quietly. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert as both sides prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether the sacred artifacts of the Apache people would remain with their descendants or disappear into them. Black market collections of the wealthy and unscrupulous. In the distance, the canyon waited, holding its remaining secrets with the patience of geological time, while the latest chapter in the long struggle between preservation and plunder played out in the high desert air. The golden trade medallion caught the lamplight like a captured sun, its surface engraved with symbols that told the story of commerce between worlds. Spanish conquistadors had carried such pieces as proof of their authority to trade in the New World. But this medallion bore additional markings, Apache symbols that had been added later, transforming it from a simple Spanish artifact into something that bridged cultures. Tahu held the medallion carefully, understanding that he was touching a piece of his family's history that went deeper than he had ever imagined. According to Agent Coleman's preliminary research, such medallions were extremely rare, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to collectors who cared nothing for their cultural significance. "This changes everything," Coleman said, documenting the medallion with the same meticulous care she had shown the other artifacts. "Pieces like this don't just prove trade relationships. They indicate formal treaties, diplomatic agreements between Spanish colonial authorities and Apache leaders. You're holding evidence of political alliances that most historians believe never existed." Marcus studied the additional markings that had been carved into the Spanish gold. "These Apache symbols, they're not just decorative, are they? They mean something specific." "Safe passage," Tahu translated, recognizing the symbols from his grandfather's teachings. This medallion guaranteed protection for whoever carried it. Spanish traders could move through Apache territory without fear, and Apache emissaries could travel to Spanish settlements under the same protection. The implications were staggering. If such formal agreements had existed, then the historical narrative of constant warfare between Spanish colonists and Apache tribes was incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. The medallion was proof that his ancestors had been sophisticated diplomats as well as fierce warriors, capable of complex political relationships that had been erased from official records. But their archaeological celebration was interrupted by Marcus's urgent voice from the window. "Uncle, we have visitors again." This time, the approaching vehicles made no attempt at subtlety. A convoy of black SUVs and modified pickup trucks moved up the dirt road with the confidence of people who had decided that stealth was no longer necessary. The treasure hunters had escalated from covert surveillance to open intimidation. Agent Coleman immediately shifted into crisis mode, coordinating with her team through encrypted communications, while Tahu and Marcus secured the most valuable artifacts. The medallion, White Hawk's medicine bundle, and the hand-drawn map were sealed in protective cases designed to survive everything, from fire to explosion. "Mr. Bigay, I need you to understand the situation," Coleman said, checking her sidearm with practiced efficiency. "These people have killed to protect their operations before. They view cultural artifacts as commodities, and they see anyone who interferes with their harvesting as expendable obstacles." The lead SUV stopped just outside the property fence, and Tahu got his first clear look at the enemy. The man who stepped out was younger than expected, maybe 40, with the kind of expensive outdoor gear that marked him as someone who treated treasure hunting as an extreme sport rather than a criminal enterprise. Behind him, armed men emerged from the other vehicles with military precision. "Good afternoon," the leader called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a door-to-door salesman. "My name is Davidson, and I represent a group of private collectors who are very interested in the historical artifacts that have recently been discovered in this area." Agent Coleman stepped onto the porch, her badge visible and her authority unmistakable. "This is a federal crime scene, Mr. Davidson. You and your associates need to leave immediately." Davidson's smile never wavered. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, Agent Coleman. My clients have legitimate contracts with several property owners in this region, giving them exclusive rights to archaeological exploration and artifact recovery. We're simply here to discuss similar arrangements with Mr. Bigay." The legal maneuvering was clearly a delaying tactic, buying time for whatever Davidson's real plan entailed. Tahu noticed that while the conversation continued on the porch, several of Davidson's men had quietly positioned themselves to surround the house. This wasn't a negotiation. It was the opening move of an assault. Ayana sensed the danger before anyone else, her agitation becoming so intense that she began calling out with the high-pitched whinnies that horses use to warn their herd of approaching predators. Her behavior triggered a similar response from Nalnish and the other horses, creating a chorus of alarm that echoed across the desert. "The horses know," Tahu said quietly to Marcus. "This isn't going to end with conversation." What happened next moved with the terrifying speed of violence in the American West. One of Davidson's men made the mistake of reaching for his weapon while within sight of federal agents, and the afternoon exploded into chaos. Coleman's team had clearly prepared for this possibility, because their response was immediate and overwhelming, but Davidson's group was equally professional, and the gunfight that erupted around Tahu's modest ranch house had the intensity of a military engagement. Bullets shattered windows and splintered wooden posts, while Tahu and Marcus took cover in the kitchen, surrounded by priceless artifacts that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to their lives. The sound of helicopters returned, but this time they were federal aircraft, bringing reinforcements that tipped the balance decisively in favor of law enforcement. Davidson's carefully planned operation crumbled under the overwhelming response, and within 20 minutes, the shooting had stopped and the handcuffs had come out. As the dust settled and emergency medical teams attended to the wounded, Tahu found himself standing in his destroyed living room, holding the golden medallion and wondering how a simple mystery about his horse's behavior had escalated into armed combat on his own property. This was never about money, Coleman explained as her team processed the crime scene. Davidson's group was fronting for international collectors who specialize in Native American artifacts. The pieces you found would have disappeared into private collections in Europe and Asia, never to be seen again. Marcus surveyed the damage to the house, bullet holes in the walls, furniture destroyed by flying glass, family photographs scattered across the floor. All of this to steal our ancestors' treasures, but it was Ayana who provided the most profound commentary on the day's events. As the sun set over the desert, painting the canyon walls with the colors of old blood and new gold, the mare approached the broken fence and gently placed another gray stone at Tahu's feet. This stone was different from all the others, larger, smoother, and marked with symbols that seemed to glow in the fading light. As Tahu examined it, he realized that Ayana's work was not finished. The hidden chamber and the dramatic confrontation had been only the beginning of her mission. "She's telling us there's more," he said, showing the new stone to Coleman and Marcus. "Bigger than what we've already found." Coleman examined the stone with her expert eye, noting the precision of the carved symbols and their obvious age. "Mr. Begay, I think your horse has been leading us towards something that's going to rewrite the history books." As federal agents secured the scene and prepared to transport Davidson's captured operatives, Tahu stood in the ruins of his peaceful life and understood that there was no going back. The responsibility that had been passed to him through Ayana's patient guidance was larger than he had ever imagined, and the enemies they faced were more dangerous than he had feared. But the golden medallion in his hand whispered of ancestors who had faced similar challenges and found ways to preserve what mattered most. If his people could hide their treasures successfully enough to keep them safe for more than a century, then he could find the courage to protect them for another generation. The desert night fell around them, bringing with it the ancient silence that had witnessed countless struggles between those who would preserve and those who would possess. Tomorrow, Ayana would lead them deeper into the canyon, towards secrets that had been waiting in the darkness for someone brave enough to bring them back to the light. The modern survey equipment hidden beneath a camouflage tarp near the canyon entrance told a story that chilled Tahu to his bones. GPS units programmed with coordinates that matched exactly the locations marked on Whitehawk's map. High-resolution cameras with telephoto lenses capable of photographing documents from hundreds of yards away. Motion detectors that had been recording every trip he and Marcus had made to the hidden chamber. Agent Coleman crouched beside the cache of surveillance gear, her expression growing darker as she catalogued each piece of sophisticated equipment. "This is military-grade surveillance technology, Mr. Begay, not the kind of thing treasure hunters typically have access to." The implications hit Tahu like a physical blow. Davidson's group hadn't just stumbled onto the existence of the hidden artifacts. They had been conducting systematic surveillance of his property for months, possibly longer. Every conversation on the porch, every journey into the canyon, every moment of discovery had been recorded and analyzed by people who saw his family's sacred heritage as nothing more than inventory to be harvested. "But how did they know to watch us in the first place?" Marcus asked, examining a wireless camera that had been disguised as a piece of dead wood. "We didn't even know what Ayana was showing us until a few weeks ago." Coleman's radio crackled with a message that made her face go pale. After a brief, encrypted conversation, she turned to them with news that reframed everything they thought they understood about their situation. "Davidson wasn't working alone," she said grimly. "Our investigation just uncovered evidence of a much larger operation, an international network that's been systematically looting Native American sites across the Southwest for at least 5 years. They use inside information to target specific locations, then deploy teams like Davidson's to harvest whatever they find." "Inside information from who?" Tahu asked, though part of him already feared the answer. "That's the problem. Someone with access to tribal records, archaeological surveys, and federal land management databases has been feeding them intelligence. We're looking at a conspiracy that reaches into government agencies, academic institutions, and possibly tribal administrations." The betrayal cut deeper than the bullets that had shattered his windows. Somewhere in the network of people trusted to protect Native American cultural heritage, there was a traitor selling information to thieves who would scatter priceless artifacts to the highest bidders around the world. As they searched the surveillance equipment for more clues, Ayana appeared at the canyon entrance more agitated than Tahu had ever seen her. Instead of carrying a stone, she paced frantically back and forth, whinnying with the kind of distress calls that horses make when they sense mortal danger approaching their herd. "She's trying to warn us about something," Tahu said, approaching his mare carefully. "Something she can sense that we can't." Coleman's radio erupted with urgent chatter from her tactical team. Satellite surveillance had detected additional vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Not the obvious convoy approach that Davidson had used, but a coordinated encirclement designed to cut off all escape routes from the property. "They're not done," Coleman said, coordinating defensive positions with her team. Davidson's arrest was just the opening move. The real operation is beginning now, but as federal agents prepared for another assault, Tahu noticed something that changed his understanding of everything that had happened. Among the surveillance equipment, partially hidden beneath other gear, was a device he recognized, a GPS tracker identical to one he had seen before. In the glove compartment of Marcus's truck, the realization hit him like cold water. He turned to look at his nephew, seeing the familiar face transformed by the weight of terrible knowledge. Marcus had been too ready with explanations, too quick to suggest involving federal authorities, too familiar with the locations marked on the ancient map. "How long?" Tahu asked quietly, his voice carrying the pain of generations of betrayal. Marcus couldn't meet his uncle's eyes. 2 years. Maybe 3. They contacted me when I was having financial troubles, offered me money just to keep them informed about any archaeological discoveries on the reservation. I never thought it would lead to this. The confession hung in the desert air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Coleman's hand moved instinctively toward her weapon, but Tahu gestured for her to wait. This was a family matter, a wound that needed to be understood before it could be healed. "You told them about Ayana bringing the stones," Tahu said. "Not asking, but stating the fact. I thought they just wanted to document historical sites. Maybe work with the tribal council on legitimate preservation efforts." Marcus's voice broke with shame and regret. "I didn't know they were thieves until it was too late. And by then, they had enough information to destroy everything we'd found." The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Coleman's team reported at least a dozen armed personnel moving to surround the ranch. But the tactical situation was the least of Tahu's concerns now. He was holding White Hawk's medicine bundle and looking at his nephew's face, seeing the reflection of every Native American who had ever been forced to choose between survival and integrity. "They threatened your family," Tahu said, understanding the deeper currents that had driven Marcus to betrayal. "My children," Marcus whispered. "They knew where my kids went to school, what route my wife took to work. They made it clear that cooperation was the only way to keep everyone safe." Ayana's warning calls intensified, and through the growing darkness, Tahu could see muzzle flashes as Coleman's agents engaged the approaching assault team. The final battle for his ancestors' treasures was beginning, but now he understood that the real enemy wasn't Davidson or his hired guns. It was the system that put Native American families in positions where they had to choose between their heritage and their safety. "Agent Coleman," Tahu called out over the sound of gunfire, "there's something you need to know about how they've been getting their information." But before Coleman could respond, the lights of the ranch house exploded in a shower of sparks as high-powered rifles took out the electrical systems. In the sudden darkness, illuminated only by muzzle flashes and the distant glow of canyon starlight, Tahu clutched his ancestors' medicine bundle and made a decision that would echo through generations. "Marcus," he said firmly, "you're going to help us end this. Not because I forgive you, but because you owe our people a debt that can only be paid by protecting what you helped put in danger." The battle for the artifacts was no longer just about preserving historical treasures. It was about redemption, about finding a way for broken families and compromised individuals to reclaim their honor in the face of forces that seemed too powerful to resist. In the darkness beyond the gunfire, Ayana's calls continued, carrying a message that Tahu was finally beginning to understand. She wasn't just warning them about immediate danger, she was calling them towards something larger, something that would require more courage than any of them had ever shown before. The real test of their worthiness to guard their ancestors' legacy was just beginning, and it would demand sacrifices that none of them were prepared to make. The emergency radio crackled to life in Agent Coleman's hand, its mechanical voice cutting through the chaos of gunfire and shouted orders. Federal reinforcements were en route, but they were still 40 minutes away across desert terrain that didn't forgive mechanical failures or navigation errors. Until then, the small team defending Tahu's ranch would have to hold against overwhelming odds. "We need to move the artifacts to a secure location," Coleman said, ducking as bullets shattered what remained of the kitchen windows. "If we lose this position, everything your ancestors preserved disappears forever." Tahu clutched Whitehawk's medicine bundle against his chest, feeling the weight of spiritual responsibility that transcended any concern for his own safety. Around him, federal agents maintained defensive positions while Marcus worked frantically to establish communications with tribal police. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The nephew who had betrayed their secrets was now their only link to additional help. "There's a place," Tahu said, raising his voice over the sound of automatic weapons fire, "deeper in the canyon than we've been. Ayana showed it to me in dreams before she started bringing the stones. If we can reach it, we can make a stand where the terrain favors defenders." Coleman assessed their tactical situation with the grim efficiency of someone who had survived similar encounters. "We'll need covering fire to reach the vehicles, and then we'll be driving through hostile territory with no guarantee that your canyon position is really defensible." "It's defensible," Tahu assured her, though he had never seen the place except in the visions that came to him during meditation. "My ancestors didn't just hide treasures there. They built a fortress that could protect an entire tribe if necessary." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Ayana appeared through the smoke and confusion, galloping directly toward the house despite the gunfire erupting around her. Her copper coat gleamed in the muzzle flashes, and her eyes held the same supernatural intelligence that had guided them to this moment. "She wants us to follow her," Marcus said, understanding his uncle's connection to the mare, even through his shame and regret. "She's not afraid of the bullets. She knows where we need to go." The decision to abandon the defensive position at the ranch required a leap of faith that went beyond military tactics. Coleman's training told her to hold their ground and wait for reinforcements. But Tahu's certainty about the canyon refuge carried the weight of ancestral knowledge that had guided his people through previous wars of survival. "All right," Coleman decided, "we'll try it your way. But if your horse is wrong about this sanctuary, we're all going to die protecting artifacts that will end up in private collections anyway." The evacuation proceeded with desperate efficiency. The most valuable artifacts, Whitehawk's medicine bundle, the golden trade medallion, the hand-drawn map, and the carved stones that had started everything were packed into protective cases and distributed among the team members. Less portable items were hidden in locations around the ranch that Coleman's people could retrieve later if they survived the night. Ayana led them away from the ranch along trails that seemed to exist only in moonlight and memory. The mare moved with supernatural confidence through terrain that would have challenged experienced desert guides, finding paths between boulders and around cliff faces that provided cover from their pursuers, while maintaining steady progress toward the heart of the canyon system. Behind them, the sound of vehicles and shouted orders indicated that the assault team was reorganizing for pursuit. These weren't amateur treasure hunters stumbling around in the dark. They had night vision equipment, GPS navigation, and the kind of military training that made them formidable opponents, even in unfamiliar terrain. "They're tracking us," Coleman reported, monitoring communications intercepted from their pursuers. "Professional-grade equipment, coordinated movement patterns. We're dealing with a paramilitary organization, not a criminal gang." The revelation explained the sophisticated surveillance, the international connections, and the willingness to engage federal agents in open combat. Somewhere behind the artifact theft operation was an organization with resources that rivaled government agencies and motivations that went beyond simple profit. As they climbed deeper into the canyon, following Ayana's lead along paths that seemed to exist only for those who knew the ancient secrets of navigation, Tahu began to understand the scope of what his ancestors had created. This wasn't just a hiding place for treasures, it was a complete survival infrastructure, designed to sustain an entire community during extended sieges. Natural springs provided fresh water. Hidden gardens in protected alcoves showed evidence of agricultural systems that could support dozens of people. And defensive positions were carved into the rock at strategic points that commanded views of all approaches. The Apache leaders who had preserved their cultural treasures had also created a refuge that could protect their descendants for generations. "It's a city," Coleman breathed as they crested a ridge that revealed the full scope of the canyon sanctuary. "Your ancestors built an entire hidden city in the heart of this desert. Below them, carved into the living rock and camouflaged by centuries of careful cultivation, was a settlement that had been waiting in darkness for more than a century. Buildings that followed the natural contours of the canyon walls, defensive positions that covered every approach, and at the center of it all, a structure that could only be described as a fortress, built to protect the most sacred treasures of a people who refused to be erased from history. Ayana led them directly to the main entrance, her hoofbeats echoing off stone walls as they passed through gates carved with symbols that spoke of protection, endurance, and the eternal vigilance required to preserve what mattered most. Inside the fortress, oil lamps still waited in their sconces, and sleeping chambers carved from solid rock offered shelter for however long the siege might last. "This is where we make our stand," Tahu said, placing Whitehawk's medicine bundle on an altar that had been carved for exactly this purpose. "This is where our ancestors always intended for us to face our final test." Coleman's radio reported that the assault team had reached the canyon entrance and was beginning to probe the defensive approaches. Federal reinforcements were still 20 minutes away, but the natural advantages of the hidden fortress gave them hope that they could hold until help arrived. But as they prepared for the final confrontation, Tahu understood that this battle was about more than protecting artifacts from thieves. It was about proving that the Apache people still possessed the courage and wisdom that had enabled their ancestors to preserve their culture. Through previous attempts at destruction, in the flickering lamplight of the hidden fortress, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of generations, he prepared to face an enemy that threatened not just their physical survival, but the spiritual continuity that connected them to everyone who had ever fought to preserve what the powerful sought to steal. The ancient stones around them had witnessed countless battles between preservation and plunder. Tonight they would witness another, and the outcome would determine whether the Apache people's cultural legacy would endure for future generations, or disappear into the collections of those who valued possession more than meaning. The ancient war shield hung on the fortress wall like a guardian spirit, its surface decorated with symbols that spoke of protection and righteous battle. Tahu lifted it from its resting place with reverent hands, feeling the weight of generations who had carried it into combat against enemies who sought to destroy their way of life. The shield had been crafted from layers of buffalo hide and hardwood, reinforced with metal taken from Spanish weapons and blessed by medicine men whose names were carved around its rim. As Tahu strapped it to his arm, he felt the presence of his ancestors settling around him like ceremonial robes, lending him their strength for the battle that was about to begin. Outside the fortress walls, the assault team had found the canyon entrance and was beginning their approach with the methodical precision of professional soldiers. Their voices carried through the stone corridors, speaking in the clipped terminology of military operations as they identified defensive positions and planned their attack. Agent Coleman coordinated the defense from the central chamber, her tactical experience combining with the natural advantages of the hidden fortress to create a defensive plan that might actually succeed. The carved stone corridors created natural choke points where a few defenders could hold against superior numbers, while hidden passages allowed for movement between positions without exposure to enemy fire. They're probing the outer defenses, Coleman reported, monitoring communications from their attackers. Professional approach, taking time to identify our capabilities before committing to a full assault. Marcus had positioned himself at one of the observation points, using his knowledge of the terrain to track the enemy's movements and relay information to the defensive team. His betrayal had brought them to this crisis, but his local expertise might be crucial to surviving it. "Uncle," he called out, "they're bringing up heavy equipment. Looks like they're prepared to blast their way through stone if they have to." The sound of explosives echoed through the canyon as the assault team began systematically destroying the outer defensive barriers. Each detonation sent tremors through the ancient fortress, but the structure had been built to withstand such attacks. The Apache engineers, who had designed this refuge, had faced Spanish cannons and cavalry charges. They understood the requirements for surviving technological superiority. Ayana had taken shelter in one of the inner chambers, but even there she paced restlessly, her instincts telling her that the crisis was far from resolved. The mare's behavior had guided them to this sanctuary, but now her agitation suggested that their ultimate test lay deeper within the fortress, in chambers that none of them had yet explored. The first assault came at midnight. Coordinated attacks on 3 separate entrances designed to divide the defenders' attention and overwhelm their ability to respond. But the fortress had been designed for exactly this scenario, and the carved stone channels funneled the attackers into killing zones where a few well-placed defenders could hold against. Overwhelming odds, Tahu found himself fighting beside federal agents with weapons and tactics his grandfather could never have imagined. But the principles were the same as every battle his people had ever fought. Protect what matters most, give ground grudgingly, and make every enemy advance cost more than they were willing to pay. The ancient shield deflected bullets that would have ended his life, its blessed surface turning aside modern weapons with the same effectiveness it had once shown against Spanish steel. Behind its protection, Tahu fought with the fury of a man defending not just his own life, but the accumulated heritage of generations. "They're falling back," Coleman reported, as the first assault wave retreated to regroup. "But they'll be back with heavier weapons." This was just a probing attack. The brief respite allowed them to assess their casualties and redistribute ammunition, but it also revealed the scope of their enemy's resources. Through the fortress walls, they could hear helicopters landing and taking off, bringing reinforcements and supplies that suggested a much larger organization than they had previously understood. "There are too many of them," Marcus said grimly, tending to a minor wound he had sustained during the fighting. "Even with federal reinforcements coming, we're outnumbered by professional soldiers who have unlimited resources behind them." But Tahu's attention was focused on Ayana, whose behavior had become even more agitated during the fighting. The mare was trying to lead them somewhere specific, deeper into the fortress than they had yet explored, toward chambers that the original builders had reserved for their most desperate hour. "She's still trying to show us something," Tahu realized, following his horse through passages that led toward the heart of the ancient sanctuary. The crystal prayer stone rested in the deepest chamber of the fortress, its surface carved with symbols so intricate they seemed to move in the flickering lamplight. As Tahu lifted it from its ceremonial pedestal, he felt a connection to his ancestors that transcended physical sensation, a direct link to the spiritual power that had guided his people through centuries of struggle and survival. This wasn't just another artifact to be catalogued and preserved. The prayer stone was a conduit, a focal point for the accumulated prayers and intentions of generations of Apache medicine men who had blessed it during the darkest hours of their people's history. As Tahu held it, he could feel their presence surrounding him. Lending their strength for the final confrontation, Ayana stood beside him in the sacred chamber, her earlier agitation replaced by a profound calm that spoke of destiny fulfilled. She had led them through weeks of discovery, guided them to safety through gunfire and explosions, and now she had brought them to the spiritual heart of their ancestors' refuge. Her work as messenger between worlds was nearly complete. "Uncle," Marcus called from the chamber entrance. "They're regrouping for another assault. Coleman says the federal reinforcements are still 10 minutes out." But Tahu barely heard his nephew's words. The prayer stone was showing him visions, images of the original battle that had led to the creation of this fortress. When Apache leaders had made the desperate decision to hide their most precious possessions, rather than watch them be destroyed by enemies who saw only monetary value in sacred objects. He saw White Hawk, the medicine man whose bundle they had discovered, leading the construction of these chambers while cavalry units searched the desert above. He watched as families brought their most treasured possessions to be sealed away, trusting that someday the right person would find them and understand their true significance. Most importantly, he saw the prayer stone itself being blessed by a circle of medicine men who had poured their spiritual power into its crystalline structure, creating a weapon that could turn the faith of generations into protection for those who truly needed it. "Agent Coleman," Tahu called out, his voice carrying new authority born of spiritual certainty, "bring your people to this chamber. All of them. Leave the outer defenses and fall back to this position." Coleman appeared in the doorway, her tactical training warring with the strange confidence in Tahu's voice. "Sir, if we abandon the choke points, they'll overrun the entire fortress in minutes." "Trust me," Tahu said, raising the prayer stone so its carved surface caught the lamplight. "Our ancestors didn't just build a fortress here. They created a sanctuary that can protect those who understand its true power." The decision to abandon their defensive positions felt like madness to everyone except Tahu and Ayana. But as Coleman's agents fell back to the central chamber, the assault team's final attack began with overwhelming force. Explosives breached the outer walls, automatic weapons fire echoed through the stone corridors, and the sound of approaching helicopters suggested that even heavier firepower was being brought to bear. Within minutes, armed figures appeared at the entrance to the sacred chamber, their night vision goggles and tactical gear making them look like technological demons invading a place of ancient power. The leader, not Davidson but someone even more dangerous, stepped forward with the casual confidence of a man who had never encountered resistance he couldn't overcome. "Mr. Begay," the man said in accented English that spoke of European education and international connections. "You have caused us considerable expense and inconvenience. We are prepared to offer you substantial compensation for your cooperation in transferring these artifacts to more appropriate collections." Tahu stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by federal agents who were vastly outnumbered, but still determined to fight. The prayer stone seemed to pulse with warmth in his hands, and Ayana moved to stand beside him with the calm dignity of a sacred guardian. "These artifacts belong to my people," Tahu said simply. "They were hidden by my ancestors to protect them from men like you, and I will die before I let you steal what they preserved." The assault team leader smiled coldly, raising his weapon with the practiced motion of someone who had ended many similar negotiations. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, something extraordinary happened. The prayer stone blazed with light, not the harsh glare of artificial illumination, but the warm, golden radiance of spiritual power made manifest. The light filled the chamber, reflecting off the carved walls and creating patterns that spoke of protection, justice, and the enduring strength of those who fight for righteous causes. In that radiance, Ayana seemed to transform from a simple horse into something far more magnificent, a spirit guide whose copper coat gleamed like burnished metal and whose eyes held the wisdom of all the ancestors who had blessed This sacred place, the assault team faltered, their technological advantages suddenly meaningless in the face of forces that their equipment couldn't measure, or their weapons couldn't defeat. Some dropped their guns and fled, while others stood frozen in awe at the manifestation of power they had never imagined possible. The prayer stone's light reached beyond the chamber, flowing through the fortress corridors and spilling out into the desert night where federal reinforcements were finally arriving. In that moment of spiritual triumph, the battle for the Apache treasures was decided not by superior firepower or tactical advantage, but by the enduring strength of faith defended by those who understood its true meaning. 6 months later, the museum display case gleamed under carefully calibrated lighting, its climate-controlled environment protecting artifacts that had survived more than a century of hiding in the desert. But unlike the sterile presentations that typically housed Native American treasures in distant institutions, this display existed in a place of honor, the newly constructed Apache Cultural Heritage Center, built on Tahu's ranch with funding that had come from the most unexpected source, the international artifact theft organization that had attacked the fortress possessed resources that extended far beyond what any of them had imagined. When federal authorities finally unraveled the complete network, they discovered a conspiracy that reached into museums, universities, and private collections across 3 continents. The monetary damages alone exceeded $50 million, and the cultural losses were incalculable. But the legal settlement had provided something more valuable than money: the resources and legal framework to create a permanent home for the recovered treasures that honored both their sacred significance and their historical importance. The Heritage Center stood at the entrance to the canyon where Ayana had first led them, its architecture blending traditional Apache design with modern preservation technology. Tahu stood before Whitehawk's medicine bundle, now properly displayed with interpretive materials that told the story of its concealment and recovery. Visitors came daily, Apache families reconnecting with their heritage, scholars studying the complex relationships between Spanish colonists and Native American tribes, and tourists who left with a deeper understanding of the courage required to preserve cultural identity in the face of systematic destruction. "The Smithsonian called again," Marcus said, joining his uncle in the museum's central gallery. "They're still hoping you'll consider loaning some of the pieces for their new exhibit on Native American resistance movements." The relationship between the two men had been slowly healing over the months since the siege. Marcus's betrayal had nearly cost them everything, but his courage during the final battle had begun the long process of redemption. More importantly, his children now visited the Heritage Center regularly, learning the stories that connected them to their ancestral identity in ways that no textbook could provide. "Some things are meant to stay home," Tahu replied, though his tone carried understanding rather than judgment. "The Smithsonian has plenty of artifacts that were taken from our people without permission. These stayed hidden until they were ready to return to us." The golden trade medallion occupied the center of the main display, its Spanish craftsmanship and Apache modifications telling the story of cultural complexity that most history books still ignored. Researchers had used it to document trade relationships and diplomatic treaties that challenged simplified narratives about conflict between Native Americans and European colonists, but it was the prayer stone that drew the most attention from visitors, though few understood the true nature of what they were seeing. Displayed in a case that allowed viewing from all angles, it appeared to be simply an intricately carved crystal. Only those who had witnessed its spiritual power understood that they were looking at something that transcended the usual categories of historical. Artifact Agent Coleman had become a regular visitor to the Heritage Center, combining her professional interest in cultural property protection with a personal connection to the people whose courage had made the preservation possible. Her investigation of the international theft network had expanded into a multi-agency task force that was working to repatriate stolen artifacts to tribal communities across the continent. We've recovered pieces that some communities thought were lost. Forever, she told Tahu during her latest visit. Your decision to fight for these treasures has created a precedent that's helping other tribes reclaim their heritage. The legal battles weren't entirely finished. International courts were still sorting through ownership claims and repatriation, requests that would take years to resolve completely. But the principle had been established that cultural artifacts belonged with the communities that had created them, not in the private collections of wealthy individuals who valued possession more than meaning. Outside the heritage center, Ayana grazed in the pasture that had been expanded and improved with some of the settlement funds. At 19 years old, she moved with the deliberate pace of a mare who had accomplished her life's great work and could now enjoy the respect and comfort she had earned. Her copper coat had begun to show silver at the muzzle, but her eyes still held the intelligence that had guided them through their extraordinary journey. School groups came regularly to hear Tahu tell the story of how his horse had led him to discover his ancestors' hidden treasures. The children listened with the particular attention that young people reserved for tales that combined adventure with deeper meaning, and many left with a new understanding of the connection between human beings and the animals that shared their world. She still brings me stones sometimes, Tahu told one such group, gesturing toward Ayana. Not the grey ones that led us to the hidden chamber, but different stones, smooth river rocks, and pieces of turquoise that she finds in the canyon. I think she enjoys giving gifts now that the serious work is finished. The most profound change had come in Tahu's relationship with the land itself. What had once been a quiet ranch where an old man lived in peaceful retirement had become a destination where Apache culture lived and breathed for new generations. The canyon that had hidden secrets for more than a century now welcomed visitors who came to learn about the courage and wisdom required to preserve what matters most. As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Tahu walked through the Heritage Center one final time, checking displays and ensuring that the artifacts were secure for the night. The responsibility of guardianship still weighed on him, but it was a burden shared now with a community of people who understood the importance of preservation. Outside, Ayana waited by the fence, a small grey stone at her feet, not one of the marker stones that had started their adventure, but a simple gift from a horse to her human companion. As Tahu picked up the stone and scratched behind her ears, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and purpose. The desert stretched away toward the horizon, holding its remaining secrets with the patience of geological time. Somewhere in the vast landscape, other treasures waited for the right person to discover them. Other stories waited to be told, and other horses perhaps carried wisdom that their human companions had not yet learned to hear. But for now, in this place where ancient wisdom met modern understanding, the circle was complete. The ancestors' trust had been honored, the community's heritage had been preserved, and the bond between human and horse that had made it all possible continued in the quiet contentment of another desert evening.